Hello, everybody. This is an introduction to the sophists, Plato, and Aristotle within our class in History and Philosophy of Collective Intelligence. I want to begin this exploration of classical Greek philosophy with this famous quote by a German philosopher of the Enlightenment, Hegel, who said in German, "The owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk." And usually, if I'm in a room with people, I ask what they think this means. But since you're watching this video, I'll share what I think this means and why I think it's important for this moment in the history of the Athenian people. We've seen up until now the great democratic revolution of Cleisthenes, the reforms of Pericles, the great art form of Greek tragedy and the festivals, city Dionysia. We've seen the successes of the Athenians in the wars against Persia, the Battle of Marathon and Salamis, the great flowering of Athenian culture, science, drama, medicine, architecture. And now at the end of this great century, the Golden Age, we see a new form of collective intelligence, a new form of thought. And we move from a time of great actions and deeds to a time of great theory and reflection. And this is what Hegel was talking about in this quote, that Minerva is the Roman name for Athena, the goddess Athena, who, as you can see in the picture, is holding a spear and a helmet. She is one of the two deities of war, one of whom is Ares, who is the bloodthirsty god of you could say, just violence in general, organized violence. And Athena has the helmet of strategos, meaning she is the goddess of strategy, of wisdom that can be applied in action. And with her, always, is her little companion, the little owl, which you'll recognize from the logo of our school. And so Hegel's point here is that wisdom often comes at the end of our actions. So we act, we learn by struggling with uncertain situations, maybe rising to the occasion, maybe inventing new forms of government, new forms of art and science. And then only afterwards do we make sense of it. So we live life moving forward and make sense of it looking backward. And so this is why at this period in the life of Greek civilization, we have new forms of thinking that seek to theorize, meaning to make universal rules and laws for human thought and human action after the action of the day is over. We begin with who are the sophists, and the sophists were a movement. You could say that has its roots, or at least some of its roots, in Sicily. Sicily was a very rich part of the Greek world. Today it's Italian, but Sicily then was Greek, of Greek-speaking cities. And at the end of the Persian Wars, there were changes in government. Pro-Persian factions were tossed out, and a rise in lawsuits. And this was an age before professional lawyers. And so there was more a demand for instruction, and this led to a rise of professional teachers, people who could instruct you on how to create arguments that would persuade an audience, persuade a jury to give you your house back, for example. And we're told later by Aristotle that the one of these teachers, a man named Corax of the very rich city of Syracuse, drew up a system that could be imparted by instruction and a set of rules dealing with such questions as were likely to arise in the context of courts, in the context of debates and arguments, how to create better arguments that are going to win over an audience. One of his students named Gorgias takes this set of skills, Corax's rule book for how to create arguments and be eloquent and speak powerfully, And he goes to Athens. So he's a Sicilian Greek who moves to Athens and thus begins a movement that we now call the Sophists. They didn't call themselves this, at least not with pride. They were often called this by other people in Athens. These are the wise guys. Sophos just means skilled or wise. And so you had men like Gorgias, Protagoras, Prodicus, who were the first professional teachers, professors in the Western tradition. This was a generation before there was any kind of university, but they were systematizers of human knowledge, and they would offer this knowledge to those who could afford it. So generally, these were the young sons of aristocratic families would pay these men to give classes in eloquence, in metaphysics, in logic, and so you see this demand for systems of thought, and as Athens becomes more complex and more rich. So there begins this movement of professional teachers called sophists. And the one we're going to learn about today is named Protagoras, who is known for his most famous citation, "Man is the measure of all things." And we're going to see what he means by this and how he relates to democracy and collective intelligence. Protagoras is not to be confused with another Greek thinker you may have heard of named Pythagoras. Pythagoras of Samos, also active in Italy, but lived about 100 years before the Sophists. Pythagoras was known as a pre-Socratic philosopher, a great mathematician, a great theorist of music, geometry, the Pythagorean theorem. You can see here about the relationship of sides of a triangle. So that's Pythagoras. We're talking in this module about Protagoras, who comes to Athens and teaches, and we think may have been one of the first to argue for democracy and why the intelligence of a large group of people might be a more effective form of government than one or two experts or strong rulers. Our friend Helene Landemore, professor of political science at Yale, in her book, Democratic Reason, Politics, Collective Intelligence, and the Rule of the Many, from 2013, she makes an argument for democracy on what she calls epistemic grounds, that whether or not you argue that democracy is the best form of government to defend human rights or for the point of view of fairness and justice, she makes the argument from the point of view of knowledge. Epistemic comes from the Greek word episteme for knowledge, which is that under certain conditions, which she says are at the high quality of deliberation, plus a mechanism for making decisions, in this case a majority vote, that the crowd is more likely to find the truth or best solution. Now we know that crowds can make very bad decisions, but what Helene argues for is that when properly organized and properly structured, as in the successful age of Athenian democracy, the crowd was more intelligent than the rival cities that were run by kings or small oligarchies. And in her book, Democratic Reason, she gives a kind of a short history of the idea of collective intelligence, which is an inspiration for my class. And she looks at two different parallel schools of thought about why crowds can be smart. And one school she calls the talkers, which she summarizes as folks who say that collective intelligence works because the reasoning of a group is like the reasoning of an individual person, but at a larger scale. And so that the important thing in producing collective intelligence is the interaction between and the quality of interaction between the members of the group. And to this, she opposes the school of the counters, which did not emphasize interaction, but emphasized rather the mathematic qualities of having a large, diverse crowd to come to a correct judgment. And this, of course, is most famously argued for by Condorcet, and also in the perhaps even more famous example of Galton, Francis Galton and the cow. Helene is the first, of my knowledge, to argue that Protagoras may have been the very first democratic theorist, a philosopher arguing for democracy in the Western tradition. As just seen, the sophists are basically knowledge consultants. How do you build knowledge? How do you communicate knowledge? And especially to win arguments in public, win arguments in court, win arguments in the assembly. We now know that of course, Athens was the richest city in Greece. So where there's demand for this knowledge, there will be a supply of it and a market for it. And so these sophists came from all over the Greek world to Athens to propose these customized courses. And because they were professionals, they were not ideologues, meaning that they would teach people of different beliefs, some who were pro-democracy, some who were anti-democracy. And so they were criticized by some as being relativists, meaning they're basically knowledge mercenaries. They'll work for anybody no matter how bad their morality is. And so we don't have a lot of their writings. In fact, most of what we know about the sophists, we know through the dialogues of Plato, which we're about to explore. We don't have any of their books. But we have enough testimonies of the sophists to know that one of the most famous remarks of Protagoras is, man is the measure of all things. And so what did he mean by this? And people have been debating this for many hundreds of years. Was he saying that basically anyone who is a good enough arguer can manipulate people's minds and make weak arguments strong? Therefore, was he helping people basically succeed using bad logic but good rhetoric? And there are those who argue against it. And so this is where we need to dive into the details. What was Protagoras actually saying? What were his arguments defending collective intelligence? Now we bring in our second main character on stage. So there was a man walking around in the Agora doing similar kinds of teaching, but a very different personality and a very different motivation. So Socrates, who you may have heard of or read about, was, according to a later philosopher and politician from Rome named Cicero, he was the one who brought philosophy down from the clouds and into the streets, meaning that made philosophy something that you could connect to your daily life. That philosophers before Socrates, we're talking now about people like Pythagoras, Thales, and Anaximander, were thinking about what the world is made of. Is it made of fire or water or air? Are there things like atoms? This is what philosophers like Democritus and Leucippus. They were what we would call physicists, and physics was the real core of philosophy up until this time. And Socrates, so the legend has it, really turned philosophy into a question about how to live. How should we live? That's the main question that philosophy should help us answer. What is good for us? What is good for us? What is good for the city? How should we organize ourselves? And he was locked into a long combat with the sophists over the course of his long career. His method we could think of as a dialogue of cooperative arguments, meaning people who could disagree with each other but who shared a common goal, which is to find the answer to some difficult problem. What is courage? What is love? What is the right way to organize politics? And in some of these cases, they would not end at any kind of satisfactory answer. They would end in what we call aporia, or kind of an impasse. Well, it could be A, it could be B, it could be C. We argue about A, we argue about B, we argue about C, and we realize that none of them can satisfy the demands of logic. And so that's how the dialogue ends. And so what you see in Socrates is really someone teaching you how to criticize, how to think critically, and even if you don't come up with a satisfying answer, you can maybe make more progress, can find a more satisfying answer than the one you had before. Another word used to describe his method is maieusis. So Socrates often claimed not to have any special knowledge. He just asked questions. And he walked around all day asking questions. What is courage? What is the good life? Do you know what really matters in the world? And his what he described himself was, his role was as someone who was helping you give birth to a truth that was already inside you. Not a teacher who was going to help you download his wisdom into your head, but rather kind of a coach, someone who was helping you do something that maybe you were always able to do but had never done, to be able to use your brain in a new way. And so in this kind of pose, he often poses what we think of as naive questions, as if he pretends to know much less than we think he actually does. And we've debated for many hundreds of years, is this because he's manipulating people and so that they fall into his traps? This is all part of the fun of Socrates and what made him such an unforgettable and charismatic character. After this catastrophic war between Athens and Sparta, at the end of the 400s, the Peloponnesian War, Athens loses the war. This was maybe the lowest point in the history of Athenian democracy. And Socrates was partially blamed for having supported, or at least not opposed, the pro-Spartan puppet government called the 30 Tyrants, who had been imposed on Athens as a punishment for losing the war. The Spartans say, okay, no more democracy. We're going to have 30 citizens of your city that we trust, 30 rich men, make all the decisions. And some of those 30 men had been students of Socrates. And he did not support the dictatorship. He didn't help them commit any of their abuses, but neither did he leave the city and join the democratic resistance led by a man named Thrasybulus. And so when the democratic resistance comes back 18 months later and restores democracy, Socrates is looked at as unreliable. He's neither pro aristocrat nor pro democrat, but he had some of his friends who had been these abusive dictators, and so he is put on trial by 3 prosecutors for the charges of corrupting the youth and introducing false gods into Athens. And we see behind this really a charge that Socrates was not sufficiently a support of democracy. He denies this strenuously. He says at his trial that he is a great patriot of Athens. He's through his questions and through his love of philosophy, trying to improve the souls, helping the Athenian citizens rediscover their better selves that they had lost over the course of the century. This incredible wealth and power and the stresses of war had lessened the quality of Athenian virtue and the quality of their thinking. And so Socrates defends himself, and the case goes to the jury, and the jury, by a very close vote, put Socrates to death. And so this is a painting of Socrates taking the poison, this poison hemlock, that was his punishment for losing his trial. So in 399, Socrates loses his trial and commits suicide. And in his apology, he gives this famous passage: "As long as I draw breath and am able, I shall not cease to practice philosophy, to exhort you, and in my usual way to point out to any one of you whom I happen to meet, good sir, you are an Athenian, a citizen of the greatest city with the greatest reputation for both wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed of your eagerness to possess as much wealth, reputation, and honors as possible, while you do not care for nor give thought to wisdom or truth or the best possible state of your soul? Then, if one of you disputes this and says he does care about his soul, I shall not let him go at once or leave him, but I shall question him, examine him, and test him. And if I do not think he has attained the goodness that he says he has, I shall reproach him, because he attaches little importance to the most important things, and greater importance to inferior things. I shall treat in this way anyone I happen to meet, young and old, citizen and stranger, and more so the citizens, because you are more kindred to me." So this is Socrates saying that of course he is not a traitor to the city. He is a defender of the city, of its better self. "Be sure that this is what the God orders me to do, And I think there is no greater blessing for the city than my service to the God. For I go around doing nothing but persuading both young and old among you not to care for your body or your wealth in preference to or as strongly as for the best possible state of your soul. As I say to you, wealth does not bring about excellence. But excellence is what makes wealth and everything else that's good for men, both individually and collectively. We'll pick up the next video with Socrates' best student, a young man named Aristocles, but you know him by a different name.